She sat beside him in court. Not to defend him, but to understand what he had turned her into. She thought she came to support her husband. She didn't expect to be seated next to the woman he swore was just a colleague. But when the witness took the stand and started speaking under oath, the truth didn't hide. Sophie from Sacramento, she sat beside the other woman in court. Series, 10 True Affair Stories from California. Sophie had always believed that silence could be elegant. And today, seated in the second row of Courtroom 6B, she embodied it. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her hair pulled into a soft knot, makeup minimal but immaculate. Beside her sat Jeremy, her husband of 15 years, a man who rarely asked for anything. So when he'd taken her hand 3 nights earlier and said, "It would mean a lot if you came," she didn't hesitate. She hadn't asked questions. Not when he told her about the contract dispute. Not when he explained the allegations of procedural misconduct. He said it was routine. He said the optics mattered. A supportive wife in court would show stability. Normalcy. She believed him. And so, she came. Sat beside him through the opening remarks. Nodded politely at the attorneys. Took notes, though none were needed. It was her presence that mattered, not her opinion. The room was bright but cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. A wall of windows overlooked Sacramento's Civic Plaza, but no one looked out. Attention stayed inside on the judge, on the evidence, on the quiet choreography of legal ritual. Mid-morning, a new name was called. Danielle Cooper. Sophie's pen stilled. The woman who entered wore confidence like perfume. Pale cream blouse, sharp heels, an elegance Sophie recognized but could not place. Until Danielle turned and smiled, briefly at Jeremy. It was a small smile. Polite. Professional. But not unfamiliar. Sophie's chest tightened. She had seen that face before. Last winter, maybe. A gala? A photo from Jeremy's phone he claimed was a team dinner? It wasn't clear. But the unease arrived fully formed. Danielle sat 1 seat away. There was an empty chair between them. Unclaimed. Accidental. Or intentional. The kind of detail Sophie noticed. The kind of detail she never ignored. She listened as the attorneys asked Danielle about vendor contracts, internal timelines, post-deadline revisions. The answers came smooth. Practiced. But there was something in the rhythm. In the way she glanced once toward Jeremy. A flicker of alignment not born of spreadsheets. Sophie kept her posture. Hands folded. Face unreadable. But inside, the air shifted. She wasn't sure what she was witnessing yet. Not exactly. But her body had already decided. This was not about contracts. It was not about oversight. It was about the unspoken space between one woman and another. She looked at the chair between them, the silence of it, and felt the growing certainty that it wasn't just a seat. It was the space where truth had been sitting all along. And now, it was watching everything unfold. Sophie didn't lean forward. Didn't whisper. She simply stared straight ahead, jaw soft but locked, and waited for the moment when what she suspected would become what she knew. Not yet. But soon. The courtroom air buzzed faintly. She folded her hands tighter. Elegance, she reminded herself, even when the script changes. Danielle sat upright in the witness chair. The courtroom adjusted around her, legal pads lifted, pens readied, a subtle stilling of breath. Sophie watched as Danielle crossed one leg over the other, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for the first question. Ms. Cooper, can you confirm your professional relationship with the defendant, Mr. Jeremy Carter? Yes, Danielle said smoothly. We worked together at Atwell and Finch for nearly 6 years. In what capacity? I was a strategic partnerships manager. Jeremy was overseeing financial operations. Our teams collaborated frequently. Sophie heard nothing unusual in that. Nothing she hadn't heard before. Then the attorney continued. Were there any interactions between you and Mr. Carter outside of normal business hours that pertain to this case? A pause. Danielle's posture remained perfect. But something in her voice shifted. Yes. There were several occasions where we met after hours to finalize documents, discuss revisions, prepare for board meetings. Where did these meetings typically occur? Sometimes at the office. Other times, off-site. Restaurants. Occasionally at one of our homes. The words dropped like stones into a still lake. Jeremy didn't move. The opposing attorney leaned forward. You said one of our homes. Were these meetings always professional in nature? Another pause. They started that way. Silence. No one turned. No one gasped. It was not a courtroom built for theatrics. But the air shifted again, thicker, heavier, laced with something no verdict could clarify. Sophie felt it settle around her. Danielle continued, her voice now carefully measured. I understand this may be outside the immediate scope of the contract dispute, but it's relevant in understanding the timeline. There were evenings when documents were signed, yes. But not always in formal settings. The opposing counsel nodded. Did Mr. Carter ever ask you to backdate agreements or conceal the context of those meetings? Danielle hesitated. There was an understanding. It was all that needed to be said. Jeremy's eyes were fixed on the table. Sophie didn't look at him. She didn't look at Danielle either. She looked straight ahead, at the edge of the judge's bench, the grain in the wood, the exact point where the light from the ceiling caught a shine in the lacquer. She stared at that spot and felt everything align. Not crash. Align. This wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. This was the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking until it was already spoken. She had thought she was here to support her husband. But she was here as part of the scenery. The supportive wife. The composed woman in the second row. A prop. A set piece in a courtroom performance that had begun long before she entered. Danielle was still speaking something about timelines, inconsistencies, late-night contract modifications, but Sophie no longer needed the content. The context had arrived. Jeremy had not denied a word. There was no objection. No turning to her with explanation, no reaching for her hand, no quiet whisper of denial. Just the silence of a man who had rehearsed his defense for the court but not for the person who mattered. Sophie sat still. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, did not tremble. Her spine remained straight. Inside, something pulled away. Not shattered. Not broken. Just detached. As if the script she had been handed, wife, ally, partner, had been gently taken back. And all that remained was a woman alone in a courtroom, watching the scene she was never meant to see, and finally understanding why she'd been invited to attend. The lunch recess was announced with a gavel tap and the polite murmur of shifting chairs. Sophie stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer as the courtroom began to empty. Jeremy touched her elbow lightly, a signal to stay close. She walked beside him without a word. The corridor outside was quiet, echoing with the soft shuffle of legal shoes and hushed conversations. Once they turned the corner, away from the noise, Jeremy finally spoke. "Sophie, I can explain dash." She stopped. Turned to face him. Her voice was calm. "Even when you asked me to sit beside you, did you think I wouldn't know who I was sitting next to?" Jeremy blinked. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked away. She didn't wait for an answer. There was no version of this where his explanation would matter more than what had already been said under oath. She shifted her bag higher onto her shoulder. "I think you knew exactly what you were doing," she said, almost softly. "You just didn't think I'd notice." Jeremy's posture stiffened. He tried to reach for her arm again. She stepped back. Not dramatically. Just enough. She pulled her court-issued visitor badge from the lapel of her jacket. Removed it gently. Handed it to the security desk without looking back. "I won't be coming in this afternoon," she told the officer. Then to no one in particular, "I'm not needed." The air outside felt sharper than it had that morning. Brighter. Less forgiving. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, adjusting to the sunlight, the open sky. And then she walked away. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent half a day listening to a version of their life collapse and had decided not to stand in the rubble for the second act. She didn't return that afternoon. She didn't answer Jeremy's messages. She didn't need a verdict to understand what had happened. Everything that mattered had already been said. And everything that hadn't, didn't need to be. 2 weeks later, Sophie submitted a short essay to a professional journal she occasionally contributed to, one focused on ethics and leadership across industries. The piece was titled "The Role You Didn't Audition For." She didn't mention the courtroom. She didn't name names. She didn't speak of betrayal or testimony or contracts signed outside business hours. Instead, she wrote about image. About how some women are invited into rooms, not for their insight, but for their presence. How partnership, in the wrong hands, can become performance. How silence, when staged, can strip someone of their voice. She wrote, "There is a difference between walking beside someone and being placed next to them. One is agency. The other is optics." The response surprised her. Emails from lawyers, nurses, editors, founders, Women who had stood beside podiums, hospital beds, campaign stages, believing they were part of something only to realize they were being used as props in someone else's script. One woman wrote, "I've been standing next to my husband for 12 years in courtrooms. But not once has he asked me what I think." Another said, "Thank you for not writing a revenge piece. Thank you for writing truth." Sophie didn't respond to most of them. She didn't go on podcasts. She declined interview requests. She refused a panel on resilient women in leadership. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She had just needed to say something true. At the end of her article, she included one final line. "Sometimes, silence in court isn't about protection. It's about permission." She never elaborated. She didn't have to. The story spoke for itself, without affidavits or cross-examinations. It resonated not because of its drama, but because of its restraint. Sophie didn't destroy anyone. She just refused to play the part she hadn't chosen. She didn't win. But she reclaimed the only thing that mattered: herself. And that was enough. Some women don't speak to win. They speak to reclaim. Not their marriages, but their voices. But in our final story, the silence doesn't linger. It's shattered. By a phone left in a hotel robe pocket. And a stranger who decides to return it. Next, we head to Santa Monica, where a forgotten call turns into a confrontation no one rehearsed. Stay with us for the final chapter in 10 True Affair Stories from California. Because sometimes, the lie doesn't fall apart on its own. Someone hands it back to you.